Hi everyone, and welcome to this week's Sunday night video. This week I am filming in Old Jesmond Cemetery, which is in Jesmond near Newcastle. This is one of hopefully several videos covering a little bit of information about some of the amazing people that are buried within the walls of the cemetery. I hope you will enjoy it and find it interesting. But before we begin, can I just say, if you do enjoy this video, then please give it a thumbs up. And if you are new here or haven't already done so, then do please consider subscribing to the channel to help support the content we create. It is absolutely free to subscribe to the channel. It doesn't cost you anything, but it really does help to support the channel. So it would be great if you did subscribe. And I finally just want to add that although I am recording this, I do have notes because I wouldn't remember all of the information without them. I am also recording in what I would call a sort of more ad-lib kind of way. So I might use a few more Geordie words than I normally do. So I hope everyone watching can understand me. So the first headstone that I'm going to look at is this one here, which is Alfred Parkin. I'm going to sort of zoom up on it a little bit so that hopefully you can see it. So Alfred Parkin was born in Gateshead in around 1879, and his parents were George and Jane, and he was one of at least 5 children. His father was a jeweller and a watchmaker, and so were his brothers James and Ralph, and his brother William was a clerk. And it seems that his sister Frances didn't actually work, as I didn't manage to find any details of any jobs for her in any of the census forms up to and including the one in 1939. His father George died in 1888, aged 57, and his mother Jane died in 1934, aged 99 years. His mother had outlived all but one of her children because Frances didn't die until 1963. Alfred trained to be a doctor, and he qualified in 1901 with first-class honours. He would work for a time at the Newcastle Infirmary at Forth Banks, and then at the RVI when it opened in 1906. Now, I did see a picture of Alfred, and I would describe him as being a thin man with short dark hair, pleasant enough features, and he wore round glasses. And he looked like somebody that you would be quite happy to have treating you if you were ill. Alfred died suddenly at home on February the 8th, 1933. I didn't find any details of the cause of death, but it was said that he had not long completed his day's work and had gone home, so it mustn't have been something that we could say that he was feeling unwell with at the time. And Alfred was 54 years old at the time of his death, and he is who you can see at the top of that headstone. At the time of his death, he was one of the most prominent consultant physicians in the north of England, and it was said he was a great loss to the community. He left a widow, Elizabeth, but the couple, who I believe had married in later life, did not have any children, and he had met Elizabeth when she was the nursing sister in one of the hospitals where he worked. And Elizabeth died in January of 1954, and you can see that she is there on the bottom of the headstone. So the next one that I'm going to talk about is right next to Alfred Parkin, and that is this one here, which is for David Lindsay Young. Now, the sun's shining quite a lot here at the moment, which is rare for this time of year, so I'm not sure if the camera's actually even focusing because I can barely see through the screen. But anyway, I'll still tell you about David Lindsay Young. So David was born in Newcastle to parents Lindsay and Ruth, and he was one of 3 children, and his father was a shipbroker. And prior to World War I, David had worked as a clerk, and he was a 2nd lieutenant in the 4th Battalion attached to the 7th Battalion Northumberland Fusiliers Territorial Force. That's quite hard to say. He died at Flanders in Belgium in 1917 at the age of just 24 years. And he is mentioned on the headstone in the cemetery along with his parents, but it is most likely that he would have been buried in Belgium where he had died. So I'm just going to zoom up a little bit and hope that you can see the writing on there. so you can see the little bit about David at the top. So the next one is a little bit further away, so I'm going to walk up and round, and I'm going to have, I would imagine, a little bit of sunlight glare in the lens, which is pretty difficult to do anything about because it's quite a nice sunny day, and that does mean that the sun does sometimes reflect quite badly in the screen. But when I get to the next headstone, I will be turning round slightly, so hopefully it will change and you will be able to see what's going on. So this is just a nice little path that comes to what is a man-made mound in basically the centre of this part of the cemetery. So what I'm coming round to now is this headstone here, which is the headstone of John Ridley and the Ridley family. So John Ridley was born in 1775 in Kent to parents Thomas and what appears to be Philadelphia, which it's quite an unusual name for that time period, but that seems to be the name. And he was one of at least 10 children. By 1783, the family had moved to Byker, but I wasn't able to find out what his father's job was. So I have no way of knowing why the family moved to Byker from Kent. But on one census form, I did note that it stated that his father was a blacksmith on the green. However, I wasn't 100% sure what kind of blacksmith they meant, as there are several different kinds. In 1803, John married Mary Redshaw in Newcastle, and the couple would go on to have at least 7 children. But sadly, 3 of their children died in infancy. John was an alderman and a magistrate of Newcastle, and he was also the mayor of Newcastle from November 1840 until November of 1841. And his son Thomas would later also be an alderman and magistrate of Newcastle. John died in December of 1843 at New Road in Newcastle when he was 68 years old. The newspapers at the time printed details of his death, but it was really quite strange because one newspaper had printed and announced his death as being the 8th of December, when he was actually still alive at that time. So although he was quite unwell, he hadn't actually died. This paper would later go on to print an apology and announce his actual death on December the 27th, 1843. Now, can you imagine picking up the paper and reading about your death? No doubt feeling rather alarmed at reading this, only to then actually die around 2 weeks later. So, looking at the headstone, you can see that his son is also on the headstone, and you can see some of his other children mentioned on there as well. And there's also a headstone right next to it with more of the Ridley family on. So they probably are all related, because this does most definitely look like a family plot. You've got some nice shadows of me holding the camera. So I am now moving on to the next one, which is Thomas William Keenleyside. Now this is an absolutely amazing monument. So as you can see, it's quite large and it is absolutely fantastic, but unfortunately it does look like part of it has come off, because that seems to be a part of this, but I'm not really quite sure where that went, unless it's come directly off the top below. No, I think it's actually come from there, because there does look to be something missing up there. But anyway, to continue on about the story about Thomas William Keenleyside. So he was born in 1798 in Newcastle to parents Richard and Elizabeth. He married Louisa Pollard in 1827, and the couple would have at least 5 children together. Now this particular memorial was erected in memory of 3 of their young children, all of whom had sadly lost their lives between December 1841 and January of 1842 as a result of the cholera epidemic. Now those children were Eleanor, who was 2 years old at the time, Charles, who was 12 years old, and James, who was 10 years old. And it must have been an incredibly tragic time for the family. Thomas was a solicitor and had worked on the town council since 1836, and it would seem he'd been asked many times to be mayor of Newcastle, but had on every occasion declined the offer. He was head of the firm Keenleyside and Foster, and was said back in 1867 to be one of the oldest members of the legal profession in the neighbourhood. Thomas died in March of 1867, although the cause of death is not known. It seems that right up until his death his health had been fine. He was actually attending a meeting and had just arrived at the location, sat down in his chair by the fire and closed his eyes, and that was it. He was gone. And he was 68 years old, and it seems most likely that he would have had possibly a sudden stroke or a heart attack. The memorial also remembers the death of Louisa Parker in 1870, the daughter of Thomas and Louisa, who appears possibly died in childbirth along with her young daughter, also called Louisa, who was only 2 days old. And Louisa Parker was only 34 years old at the time. And another name on the memorial is that of Alexander McLennan, who died in 1888 and was the husband of Rosina Keenleyside. Louisa Keenleyside, Thomas's first wife, he didn't get married twice, Thomas's wife, died in 1882, aged 80. Both Thomas and Louisa are together on the memorial. And this memorial itself is grade 2 listed, and it is rather impressive, and I'm going to walk around it in a minute and let you see a little bit more of it and the other names that I mentioned. And it stands in a section of the cemetery where many of the more well-to-do people of the time are buried. And the inscripted part of the tomb, which is this part here, is under what I believe is called a canopy, which is that there. And it is, like I say, a very impressive memorial, and it would no doubt have cost quite a bit of money at the time that it was made. And on the top of it there, you can see what I would say is a sleeping child. And that was probably because, as I say, the memorial was originally put in place for basically the 3 children that had died. So it is beautiful, but obviously at the same time it does tell a very sad tale. So I am now just going to walk round this headstone so that you can see the other names that I mentioned. You probably can't see them all that well, but that there is a side which mentions Alexander McLennan. And then when you come around to this side, this is where you have Louisa Parker. Now, because of where the sun is, you probably can't see that. I can't see it when I'm zooming it in, so I'm just hoping that you can. And then when I come round to the other side, this is where Thomas and Louisa are mentioned. So that is all of those that I mentioned in the story before, and like I say, that does look like a sleeping child to me. It doesn't have wings at the back, so I would definitely say that it was a sleeping child, done most likely because of the children that the memorial was originally made for. So anyway, that's all I'm going to do for this particular video, because there is quite a lot of people in here that I want to talk about, and I couldn't possibly put them all on one video, so that's all I'm going to do for this one. So I do hope that you have enjoyed it and that you have found it interesting, and I do thank you all very much for watching, and I do hope to see you all again very soon.